Welcome to the Longevity Optimization Podcast, where we discuss longevity, optimal health, nutrition, peak performance, cognitive excellence, and so much more.
All right, Dr. Garrison, it's such a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Nice to meet you finally.
Yes, and I know. This is probably a topic that I'm most excited about.
Okay, well, me too.
All of the things. So, you're doing incredible work at the Buck Institute, and you're really focusing on female ovarian aging.
Mm-hmm.
I would love if you could talk a little bit about your background. I know you started really with the brain, but this has led you now to female reproductive health.
Exactly. So true. I'm actually a chemist. My PhD was in chemistry, and then my postdoctoral work was in neuroscience. Mm-hmm. So when I started my lab, I have my own research group at the Buck Institute. When I started at the Buck Institute, I was thinking about aging, right? Buck obviously is an independent academic research institute that brings together scientists and clinicians across lots of different disciplines to study mechanisms of aging. And so when I came to thinking about aging, I was like, I'm not so interested in the downstream consequences. There's plenty of people working on that. How do we remediate once the damage is done? Rather, I was really focused on what are the very first dominoes to fall? What's the most upstream stuff that we can think about to target with respect to systemic aging, right? So my work, my training was really around neural circuits and behavior. Yeah. And so thinking about the part of the brain that I call, that mediates the mind-body connection. So thinking about how does your brain, which truly is the master regulator of your whole body, how does your brain talk to the rest of your body, right? Because it's both dictating what's happening, but then it's constantly listening to and integrating feedback. And so there's this two-way chemical conversation that's going on. And that's really what sets up all of your homeostatic systems, all of the things that keep you alive, right? So body temperature, fluid and energy homeostasis, circadian rhythms, but also reproductive function. And so when I started, the part of the brain that I think of as the coolest part of the brain, even though it's a really, from the neuroscience perspective, it's not as exciting as the cortex and consciousness. It's the part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is very, it's ancient. And it's really deep in your brain. So if you kind of triangulated here,
yeah, okay,
almost as deep as you could possibly go. It's the size of a grape in a human. And this is where the neurons that control those circuits, that control homeostasis, are located. And so with age, obviously there's inflammation that occurs, everywhere in your body with age that goes up. But in your brain, it's not uniform. So in your brain, it happens in particular hotspots. And hypothalamus is one of those hotspots. So just during normal aging, inflammation goes way up in your hypothalamus. And this is also the place that I think of it kind of like the brain's Wi-Fi, right? So it's making and using a lot of these long-range chemical signals that we sometimes call hormones. Hormone's a loaded word because it's a very vague word that just means any chemical moiety. So it could be a protein, a peptide, a lipid, a small molecule, a gas.
Yeah.
Any small molecule, any chemical really that mediates communication between two sites that aren't connected. So could be distant tissues, could be cells that are nearby each other but not actually connected. And anyway, this part of the brain makes tons of these hormones that travel back and forth and that mediate this kind of Wi-Fi. And so I thought, well, maybe that age-related inflammation is changing the way those neurons that control homeostasis are set or are talking or receiving information, and that might be some of the things that we think about that happen during normal aging, right? So when you think about what happens to a body over decades during normal aging, the things that change are exactly those homeostatic systems, right? Energy and fluid homeostasis, circadian rhythms, body temperature regulation, and reproductive function, right? Reproductive function is one of the earliest things to change. So that's, sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying that's where we started.
I love that.
And we were hunting down the mechanism by which one of these long-range signals impacts aging, and that brought us to the reproductive system. So it's not where we meant to go, but that's kind of where we ended up. And about 6 years ago, we had a donor come to us and ask at the Buck Institute if we would start a center to study aging in the female system through the lens of those organs that we call we call reproductive organs, but I would love to stop calling them that. What should we call them? We should call them ovaries and fallopian tubes and uterus.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think calling them reproductive organs has allowed, like, all of history, everyone for the last century to really pigeonhole all of women's health through the lens of fertility and make it small, when what we're talking about is half the population, and women's health is not a niche subcategory of medicine that's related to reproduction. It's much bigger than that. So yeah, don't call them reproductive organs.
Good. Well, I'm glad now I'm going to be breaking it down.
Yeah, sorry, that was really long.
No, I like that answer.
You should interrupt me.
No, I love listening. Well, first of all, thank you to that donor, because we're so grateful for them.
Yeah, that was the genesis of all the work that we are doing. And in fact, that was the Be Echo Foundation. And since then, of course, we've had lots of other donors come in, and we're grateful to all of them. We rely on philanthropy. So, we're not a company, and we're not selling anything. But that was really the beginning of me, honestly, thinking about my own body.
Yeah.
And I was in my early 40s. And to be honest, I had never really thought beyond, like practical things that I had to deal with on a monthly basis related to my menstrual cycle, and sort of vague, biological ticking clock kinds of concerns that impacted most of the decisions I made as an adult. I had never really thought about how my ovaries work or what they do.
Yeah.
Which is like really embarrassing, actually.
But it's really common. I think I'm kind of an outlier really thinking about this because of the space I'm in. But no, it's such a good point. So when we talk about ovarian aging, I'm very familiar with like the 14 hallmarks of aging, right? What of those hallmarks, or what is the process of ovarian aging?
Well, so here's the thing. Ovaries are no different than your other tissues in that what we know about them so far, and again, we don't understand everything about aging either, but the processes, the pathways, the molecules, the things that we know about aging in other tissues also hold true in ovaries. So things like mTOR signaling, NAD signaling, all of these things are really important and clearly play a role in ovarian aging. So they're not different from your other tissues in that sense. What makes them very different, though, is that they're aging faster. So what's happening in the rest of your body is accelerated in your ovaries by at least twofold. So ovaries are aging faster than the rest of the tissues in female bodies. And that acceleration essentially sets up both an inequality, but also it means that at baseline, males and females are different in terms of their health span. So females live longer than males on average, but females have a shorter health span at baseline, and it is directly because of aging, this accelerated aging in your ovaries.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Where are you at in the research? Why do we think, is it the brain then? Is it the brain telling the ovaries to?
Let's be clear. First of all, I'm totally biased, so I'm of course I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
I think that brain-ovary axis of signaling is really the key. However, the answer is we don't know. Like for most things in women's health, we don't know the answer because we literally haven't collected the data or done the work. We have ignored female physiology for all of biomedical research history until very recently. And so we're coming from, I would say we're like a century behind where we need to be in terms of understanding. So the answer to most questions is we have no idea. What we do know, the things we know are related to what happens when either ovaries stop working properly or when you take them away.
Yeah.
Right. So whether you remove them surgically or whether they go through this kind of dramatic change in how they function, either at and after menopause or in younger women who have primary ovarian insufficiency or failure. But when that, I think I have historically been guilty of this, but I'm trying to change the narrative here. We have to stop bookending the conversation with fertility and menopause. Those are two really important aspects of ovarian function, no question. But that's not all they do. Ovaries sit, like your brain, ovaries sit at the center of a complex signaling network, and they are talking to almost every tissue in your body. They're talking not just to your brain, but to your heart, to your bone, to your liver, to your skin. And all of those axes of communication are different and complex, and I don't mean to trivialize them, and we don't understand them. But what we do know is what happens when ovaries aren't working or you take them away. And so nowadays, I try to call them the architects of health in female bodies. And when you have dysfunction in ovaries, when they're not working properly at any age, so in a girl who's 10 or in a woman who's 85, that uncovers different health risks, different disorders, and different diseases, depending on who you are as an individual. So in that girl who's 10, if her ovaries aren't functioning properly, she might have issues going through puberty. Or if she's gone through puberty, she might have irregular menstrual cycles, or issues with her thyroid, or crazy acne. And that's all related to ovarian dysfunction. For a woman in her 20s, underlying ovarian dysfunction might uncover risk for things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, or endometriosis, because even though that originates in the uterus, it's really about a conversation between uterus and ovaries, again, that we don't fully understand. And again, then like for a woman in her 30s, we're totally familiar with the downstream consequences of ovarian dysfunction with respect to infertility, miscarriages. And then for a woman in her 40s, when ovarian function starts to fluctuate, right? It doesn't just go down in a nice stereotypical way that we see on that average curve. It's going like this at the level of an individual. That uncovers all of those 135 and counting symptoms that we associate with perimenopause. And then at and after menopause, it uncovers risk for cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, autoimmune disorders, stroke, neurodegenerative disease, all those things that we talk about now. Yeah. So it's really about health. It's about maintaining health across female lifespan.
What do you think the possibilities are in terms of extending ovarian health? I mean, I've seen some interesting I think research on rapamycin potentially extending.
We funded parts of that. So, the goal, if I had to sum it up in one sentence, my goal, both with my own research in my lab at the Buck Institute, but also with the global consortium that we are, and the center that we have, is to try to understand how ovaries work, full stop.
What do we know now about?
Almost nothing. In service of trying to sync up aging in ovaries with aging in the rest of a woman's body, as a way to extend female health span. And so the question of what's driving it, what are those underlying drivers? That's the $1 trillion question. Why is it so different between individuals, right? At an individual level, ovarian function is so stochastic. It's not just that graph that we see with the single inflection point in the cliff. Yeah. That's on average. But at the level of the individual, lots of healthy young women go through periods of infertility and dysfunction that are unexplained. Lots of older women have periods of hyperfertility that are unexplained. And so there's just a lot that we don't get. But the goal, it's not to end menopause, which is sort of a distraction from the real conversation, because menopause is about menstruation, and we're not talking about extending periods forever. What we're talking about is maintaining that endocrine function of ovaries, right? The signaling network, all of that stuff, to maintain it for as long as possible, to stave off all of those things that happen when ovaries aren't functioning properly. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No,
and so where the research is, which is the question you asked, I would say we're at the very beginning, and to be quite frank, it's primitive. We're at the stage, so we've been funding, the consortium is, the center is there to be the hub and the center of the universe with respect to this new scientific field that we're building, which is at the interface of longevity science, which you're very familiar with, and reproductive biology, which is a really mature field and has historically been focused around maternal fetal health and reproductive biology in the sense of fertility and honestly a lot of research has been around making more bigger, better farm animals.
Interesting.
And we're kind of lucky that it started there with this, trying to make more bigger, better animals, because that means that a lot of the early foundational work was done in these large mammals, like cows and sheep and horses, like these large mammals that have reproductive systems that are much closer to humans than, for example, like mice. And so in some ways, some of that early foundational research being done in large mammals means that we have better information than we might have if it had started the way that most biomedical research starts, which is in like lower organisms. Not that those organisms don't have there's great questions you can ask there, but they're very specific. Anyway, what we're trying to do is to make this new field, which we're calling reproductive aging, but again, I think we need another name for it. But it would be at the interface there and thinking about how aging specifically for females in female reproductive organs really influences aging in the rest of the body.
Yeah. You're looking at, if I read correctly, you're kind of looking at younger women with, rapidly declining ovarian health, right? To get an understanding of maybe what's happening with them, to then understanding what's happening on the big picture.
Well, we're funding research, so we fund grants to scientists all over the world. I mean, the reason we are where we are, there's, they're obvious now, but societal taboos around talking about female bodies, which I think are largely being shattered.
Yeah,
that's one thing. But then there's this data desert, right? There's a gap in data that we've been talking about that's just profound. And that is directly because there has been no funding on the governmental research funding side. And that's really what drives investment as well. So there's been very little funding on both sides. And so we're trying to fill that gap until the NIH, it's a big ship to move. So until they step in and really take over, we're funding grants to scientists. So for example, that study you cited, which is happening at Columbia University. One of our grantees, Yushin Sa, partnered with a doctor there to set up what turns out to be the very first clinical study in women where the endpoints they're measuring are not for fertility, they're for ovarian aging. And so it doesn't really matter what the results are. And they're still in the middle of that study and everything's blinded, so there are no actual results. But even if that study, even if that molecule fails, it sets up, it's a landmark study because it plants a flag. And it's the first, of what I hope will be many clinical trials for interventions that would change ovarian aging. So that's really exciting. But that's just we've funded 49 scientists so far all over the world, and there are so many discoveries that have come in the last 4 years. The pace of discovery is much faster and much better than I could have ever hoped for. So it's really we're really at this inflection point that I think is both exciting and also thank fucking God.
I know.
We need this. Yeah.
I mean, it's wild that we're talking about the first, ever. I mean,
you can't even, oh my God. We funded grants, very broadly because we don't know what we don't know, and we don't even know where to look for those driving factors. It could be one thing that happens during development. It could be one thing that happens during puberty. It could be 5 things that happen at different time points. We have literally no idea. So we funded a lot of really broad research. And some of the things we funded 4 years ago were the first omics studies, the first single cell sequencing or things like that in ovaries, both in mice and in humans across ages. And we literally just a few months ago, and from that initial work, tons of other people have come into the field, which is so great. But from that initial work, we had to have a meeting about 3 months ago where we brought together, I think, more than 60 different scientists from all over the world who now have been doing kind of large-scale omics studies, whether single cell or a single cell with spatial data. We had to get together for 4 days in a room because right now it's very difficult to impossible to compare across them because we've never actually decided as a field what to call a cell type in an ovary. Wow, that's where we are. Can you imagine saying that about your heart?
Oh my gosh.
Or your liver? No, right? No. And so we did for over 4 days, and this was for fallopian tubes, for uterus, and for ovary. It was wonderful. It was sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative because they do this. They have these large-scale tissue databases for researchers where they, for human and for mouse and across aging. They're amazing, and they didn't have reproductive organs for females for a long time. They're doing that now, but they sponsored it, and we sat down for 4 days, and now we have a framework within which we can compare across data sets because we named some of the cell types in the ovary. We have an ontology for what to call cells in the ovary.
I'm so excited. Can you share what's up so we all know?
I mean, yeah, it's not simple. Ovaries are pretty complicated, right? In the grand scheme of things, they're like a microcosm that reflects female physiology, right? We're complex, and we have to treat.
In all ways, we're complex.
In all ways. And female physiology is the most beautiful and complex thing in all of human health. And that's also true for ovaries. If you think about it, there's so many different things happening. It's not like your liver, where if you were to slice through it, it's, pretty homogeneous. You can pretty much tell what's what. And there's a couple of different cell types, and they all have very prescribed functions. But the ovary, it's... I think of it as like a ball of balls, so all different size balls.
Wow.
But then, if you think about the trajectory of going from like the most primitive primordial follicle, which is the thing that's just sitting there for decades, waiting.
Yeah.
Once it gets recruited to grow, every month you have 1,000 of those that are recruited to grow during your cycle. Once it gets recruited to grow, it takes about a little over a year to go from the point of being a quiescent primordial follicle to something that could be ovulated. So there's that time scale.
Wow.
And so it's changing across a year. But then there's also the time scale of 28, which is total myth, but whatever your cycle is, 30-ish days or 26 to 30 days. There's also that time scale where things are going through, that's kind of the tail end of this developmental window. But each month, 1,000 primordial follicles get recruited to grow. And so every month, and so you can imagine if you think about what that means in your ovaries at any given time, there's just so much dynamic stuff happening, like this macroscopic remodeling at the level of the tissue. And then there's also at the microscopic level, at the cellular level, the cells that, the egg is the egg, but the cells that surround it in the follicle, the ones that are closest to it are called granulosa cells. A granulosa cell in a very a less developed follicle will go through the same cell, will change identity. It changes shape, it changes what hormones it makes, it changes everything it does across both of these trajectories. So there's so many different changes and cell states, and it's beautiful, but also, a little complicated.
Yeah.
So we're just now mapping out like what the ovary looks like.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, that's where we're at.
Hi guys, I'm going to interrupt this episode for a brief announcement. As you may or may not know, I started a community for females by females, and it's a female longevity optimization community. This is a place that you can connect with like-minded women. We are all here to support each other, and there's a variety of different benefits to being a member. You get a monthly Ask Me Anything, so submit your questions and I'll answer them directly. We also have an entire library of courses on all of the important components of longevity, such as labs, nutrition, exercise, sleep optimization, longevity optimization protocols that I'm doing, along with real-time updates to my personal protocols. There are so many benefits of being a member of the community. We'll also be doing in-person live events here in California and virtual events for anyone that can't attend. But if you're interested in joining the community, I would absolutely love to see you there, and I will include a link in the show notes.
If we think about, what do you feel is potentially the most promising, right? So if we look at the case of rapamycin, right? So it's an immunosuppressant. And what do you think the mechanism could potentially be there?
Who knows? I mean, certainly a very reasonable hypothesis would be that it's an immunosuppressant at high doses, right? It's an immunosuppressant. At low doses, which is what we're talking about, it probably has some anti-inflammatory properties. And obviously inflammation with age is a real problem, and it's a hallmark of aging. But who knows? At low doses, it's not so clear what it's doing necessarily. There's so many things like that. I mean, it's the norm, not the rule, that we typically don't know how drugs work, right? To know the mechanism with some certainty is like, that's the very, like, not the minority of things. The vast majority of things that we use as drugs, we don't understand how they work. Take the GLP-1s, for example. We know what GLP-1 does. Normally in physiology, it's a neuropeptide. It's important for satiety, but the GLP-1 drugs mimic levels of the hormone that are 10,000 times what you would normally find in your body. So who knows what the mechanisms are that are happening there? We don't know.
Interesting. Well, I can't wait to find out.
I know this is the thing. So and I mean, we don't have enough time to go through all the 49 different grants that we've given away, and then also talk through all the things happening in the center that are exciting. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of cool stuff happening. I think we're still at the stage where the lowest hanging fruit and the things that are going to be, available to women in the next, 1 to 5 years are going to be biomarkers, diagnostics, products. And those are super important. I call those Band-Aid solutions because they're not truly moving the needle in terms of like therapeutics or interventions, but those will come. Yeah. The science that we're doing right now is absolutely essential and really generating the IP to fill that drug pipeline because it's empty right now. We don't have any drugs that are anywhere near ready for prime time for this, but it's coming.
I'm excited. When it comes to, are there any biomarkers that you can look at now that's going to, I mean, I know age for like maybe the amount of follicles or eggs you might have, but is there anything you can look at to understand your ovarian?
AMH will tell you about the follicles that are developing, right? So how many are actually, how many follicles are developing. So that's great for fertility. And there's a handful of other things that we understand with some precision, but we're frustratingly not there yet in terms of having what we should have had for the last 50 years, which is a women's health diagnostic panel. You should be able to go to your doctor for your physical or your pap smear and have, a panel of biomarkers that will tell you, number one, where are you in that trajectory? Like until we can extend endocrine function of ovaries, you should at least be able to know where you are because it's so variable between individuals. It's not like you can look at your watch and say, well, I'm 32. So I'm on average, I'm this many years from menopause, but at an individual level, you might be 14 years off of that curve. And so those kinds of things are coming, but we don't have them yet. And it truly is because we haven't collected the data.
Where are we at with, so the omics, I'm very familiar with True Diagnostics, who's doing a lot of the biological age testing. I did see that they rolled out, I think, some organ testing. I'm not sure how accurate it is at this point. Are we going to have something like that for ovaries?
That's the hope, right? Okay. That's the hope and the promise. I think for all of those biological age tests, they're incredibly useful research tools. I think that I'm of the opinion that using them in humans is really premature right now because we don't know what they mean. So the question is, I think we've answered the question, can you measure biochemical or cellular features that tell you something about the rate of aging? And I think the answer is yes. There's lots of different things that we've measured that we think might tell us something about the rate of aging. But what it's telling us and what it means for all of these tests is we don't know yet. And so that's why I think it's premature to give them to people because at the end of the day, it's a lot, it's expensive and we don't really have a good handle on what it means. That's not to say that in, 6 months, there won't be like a landmark study that really gives us a handle on that. But it's because it's hard to do these experiments in humans. Like what you really need is longitudinal data, and we don't have that kind of time. Right. So the question is, how much large-scale data can we collect across all of these different markers that we think are measuring rates of aging in different ways, and then make sense out of it. So there's a lot of hope But I do think it's a little premature to sell people that they can know something about their biological age. And the reason I say that is because, I'm sure you've done this yourself. You're one of the most tested people on the planet. So maybe you should be talking about this. But, you can take the same test at different times of the day or across different days and get completely different results. So
I like the data, but I'm kind of also really heavily leaning on like those tried and true, like grip strength and gait speed, and
how easily can you get out of a chair without touching something?
Exactly.
If you're older.
I'm excited for it all. I do pretty much all the tests just to see what comes. Of course, and
That's all you can do at this point. For women, they ask me, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a PhD scientist, so I don't give medical advice, but I can tell you what the data says, and I can also tell you what I do. And I think at this stage, the best and most powerful thing that women can do is to arm themselves with information about their own physiology, right? Especially young women. I think part of those societal taboos that have been shattered, one that still lingers is around menstruation and menstrual cycles. I think, certainly I would have never talked about my menstrual cycle publicly when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I thought of it as kind of a nuisance and just something like that I had to deal with and get through. And I just assumed that I was going to have some underlying dysfunction like pain or bloating or dramatic mood swings. Like I just took that as part of what I had to suck it up and deal with. But I think that we can project a different message now to younger women, and that is that your cycle and understanding like really at high resolution exactly what your cycle looks like, you should think of that as a superpower.
I agree.
Right? And you can harness that. Like if you really understand how your body works, you can take advantage of every single one of those highs and lows.
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do.
And so that's the message I think we should be broadcasting now is you have a superpower and you should just learn how to use it.
I love that. I use, I'm an Ovaring and I connect with the Natural Cycles app. So I learned so much. And then, I even kind of program my workouts around your peak strength, ovulation.
Athletes have been doing this for a long time.
Right. I love it. Well, super, super exciting. I can't wait to get more info. Just to, if women are wondering how can they, if possible, I know we still need a lot of data, but, extend any ovarian reserves, ovarian health.
Yeah.
What would your recommendation
At this point, what we can say is that, like I said, all of the pathways that we know about that function in the rest of your body are also functioning in your ovaries. It's just accelerated. And so anything that impacts aging in your other tissues is going to impact your ovaries. And so that means that diet and exercise are by far, like thinking about how you move your body and what you put into it are by far the biggest levers that we have to pull. And I wish I had something more satisfying to say, but that really is the truth. I do think that with respect to ovarian function, certainly sleep is one of the biggest things that impacts your physiology. And again, just arming yourself with information, knowing for the things we can measure, exactly what your normals are, so that if anything moves off of normal, you can spot it immediately. And you can have that knowledge and that certainty that it is different than it should be. And hopefully that will give women more agency and more confidence to go to their doctors, because a lot of times, because we don't know, what we don't know, I think physicians are very, they tend to be really conservative. And, if a doctor tells you, well, don't worry about that, it's normal to, move around.
Yeah, of course.
Most women will kind of be put back on their heels and be like, okay, well, whatever. And then not get the care that they need. And I think if you really know what's normal and you see it move and you have that certainty that there's something different, that you can push back a little bit better.
What do you think about early intervention of HRT, in a perimenopause state? Could that potentially extend?
Again, we need more data, but there's, I think, a lot of promising preliminary data to suggest that that's the case. And I don't call it HRT anymore.
What do you call it?
Well, because if you say hormone replacement therapy is
would
replaced,
indicate they're gone. Yeah.
well, I would say that for women who are in their 20s who have primary ovarian failure, which means that they go into menopause overnight for reasons we don't understand. It's right. You think it's so sad. And the medical community treats it like a medical emergency and really like throws the kitchen sink at it. When exactly the same process happens 20, 25 years later, we call it normal and tell women to suck it up.
I also think that's so sad.
There's a cognitive dissonance there that's like mind-blowing because it's the same process. Anyway, but it's a tragedy and a medical emergency when you're 20, but when you're 45 or 49 or 52, it's just like, suck it up. Sorry, but I want to answer your question because I can really move around and I don't mean to. But I just call it hormone therapy or menopause hormone therapy because replacement makes it sound like there's something wrong with women at and after menopause, and there is not. And ovaries are still doing something after menopause. I think most women don't realize that. Again, we only know what happens when you take them away, but in postmenopausal women who have their ovaries removed versus who keep their ovaries, the women who have their ovaries removed have poorer health outcomes. So there is still something happening there. It's just very different from what they were doing before. But the question of whether, trying, and to be clear, like hormone therapy is, it's an amazing Band-Aid. It's the best Band-Aid we have to treat all of those health conditions that are related to peri and postmenopause. But it's primitive, right? It hasn't really changed. There's been no innovation except for the introduction of the estradiol patch, patch versus oral. There's been no innovation since it was introduced. And part of that has to do with all of the misinformation around the WHI study. But, I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation there. And while it's a Band-Aid, we can make it a lot better. But I do think that there's certainly a lot of evidence that, making sure you maintain those two hormone levels is beneficial. So if you can start it sooner, then, and that's a conversation with the doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read that if you have children after the age of 30, you have, I can't remember the exact stats, but exponential increase in potential lifespan. And same thing if you have children over 40. Have you read about this at all?
Well, so there's a lot of studies like that. And really you can think about the age at which you're having a child as a proxy for age at menopause, right? Age at natural menopause is really just, it's the day on which you haven't had a period for 12 months. But obviously you can't have children if you're not cycling. So there's a correlation, and we don't understand causation, but there's a strong correlation between going through menopause later on average and living longer. So there's a positive correlation between women who go through menopause later tend to live longer. But it's important to say that that's like a statistical average across a large data set. So at the level of the individual, again, everything's stochastic. And so it doesn't mean that if you go through menopause early, you're going to die young. But it is, that correlation is really interesting because it extends to male brothers. So there's an underlying genetic component of age and natural menopause that's shared between sexes that's important for longevity. So understanding ovarian function is important for more than just women.
I love that.
Yeah. So again, like the age at which you have your last child is a correlate for your ovarian function and for your age at natural menopause. So all of those things are true.
Got it. Do we, how we have like the blue zones and the longest lived people, and we kind of follow them around and do, some research. Do we have like the age of the woman in the latest menopause, or are we able to
this
research?
is an interesting question. And I, when we first started working in this space years ago, and I started giving talks about this, I got so many emails, and I had so many women coming up to me after I gave my talk saying, you should study me because I'm 56 or I'm 58 and I'm still cycling. And I was like, oh, cool. At first I was like, oh yeah, totally. And then I started collecting these stories and collecting this information. And I realized that sometimes women think they're cycling and they're not.
Okay.
But also, again, it comes down to this, like, we don't understand like the inter-individual variability. And I actually don't think it's unusual. I actually think that there's just this huge range. There's, to be called normal, age in natural menopause can span 14 years. So 51.7 right now is the average. Don't quote me. It's something like that. Is the average age. But it's a bell-shaped curve, and there's lots of people out here, and there's lots of people out here. And again, we don't understand why it's so variable at the level of the individual. But if we did understand that, that would give us a clue about what those underlying drivers are and push us towards, having the knowledge that we need to do these interventions. So it's all very like tantalizing and exciting. But I actually don't think. I also used to have women telling me that they had miracle babies, like, oh, I had a baby when I was 50. I had a baby when I was 49 naturally. And I'm like, that's not a miracle. That's your biology. It's just, that's how little we understand ovarian function, quite frankly.
Are there any, like, you do a genetics test, right? And you can think, oh, you detox better or worse, and, you might have the MTHFR. Are there any gene correlations with any of this?
Yeah, there's been some really, so age in natural menopause is, it slips a little back and forth, but, something like 20% of that is determined by your genetics. And there have been several landmark studies published in the last few years, mostly out of labs in the UK, some in the US, around what contributes to that, at least from a genetic standpoint. And one of our grantees actually, what she published was that something like more than 90% of the hits that they got. So it's a GWAS study, a genome-wide association study. And so they find places in the genome where, above a statistical threshold, this loci, this part of your DNA is totally, like, what's here totally helps determine age at natural menopause, right? And almost all of those spots were outside of coding regions. So normally we think about, when you do gene association studies, you're looking for genes, right? You're looking for hits that are inside of protein coding regions, genes. These are all outside of genes. So most of the hits fall in these regulatory regions. And so it's much harder to find specific genes that are, because these regulatory regions can influence like lots of different things nearby, but they can also influence things that are really far away, and it's a much harder problem to solve. So so it's cool and interesting, and there's a lot of landmark studies, but it's not like, they could say like, oh, it's ApoE, like all these mutations in ApoE are associated with, older age at menopause or earlier age at menopause. No. All the hits that they find, most of them are outside of the genes. So they're in these regulatory regions that can influence all kinds of things.
Would that be like in the epigenome then?
Well, there's things like that too, but no, we're talking about coding changes at the DNA level, but not inside of genes, right? Because most of your genome is actually not made up of genes. It's made up of all this regulatory stuff, which turns out to be important, unfortunately, and trickier to study.
Absolutely. I've heard before that there is essentially you can do a telomere test of an ovary. Do you know anything about this?
I mean, telomeres are just, you know what a telomere is? Yeah. So telomeres are just these pieces of DNA that, get shorter every time your genome is replicated inside of a cell. And there's a lot of controversy around whether your telomere length is related to hallmarks of aging. And early studies said yes, like telomere shortening is one of the things that drives aging. But there are more recent studies showing that actually it has nothing to do with aging. And, this isn't my area of expertise, so I'm not going to make a call there. Yeah. But every cell in your body has telomeres. then
I
that goes
to
for
find the one in the old. I keep throwing out different ideas. Yeah, and it's like we need to know this.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I mean, honestly, I think, again, for me, it comes down to, I think that there's lots of tantalizing data, especially in animals, but also in humans, that what's going to be important is actually not the egg itself or even the follicle necessarily around the egg, but that the somatic tissue, the rest of the ovary, the nest, so to speak, the rest of that tissue is what's going to be important for discovering the things that we want to discover. And so that's where we're really focused.
Yes, I agree. So, okay, how do we get more funding to this cause? I mean, because we were thinking about it. My friend who was with me last night, we were kind of trying to like break it down. Like, okay, if I have 400,000 followers on Instagram and they all donated $5, and then
that would make a huge difference.
We did this like with I knew a lot of other women in the space, as I'm sure you do. So how do we make that happen? How much money would make a big impact?
Yeah, so we're at the stage now where we're about to do a large philanthropic fundraise in service of raising enough money to continue giving away the grants, right? Mm-hmm. Because like we've only given away $14.5 million so far to 49 scientists all over the world. And we have now this track record, and you can see like we're reworking our website right now because we changed our name. We used to have this long name and the word reproductive was in there. And I can't tell people to stop calling them reproductive organs and have that in our name. Yeah. So we're changing our name to productivehealth.org. Get it? Yeah. Reproductive with Ari crossed out. Yep. And reworking our website. And as soon as that's done, I'm going on a huge fundraising, tear, because I think we should have a lot more funding behind this. Like when we give away our grants, we've done 2 cycles. And each time our funding rate was less than 8%, meaning that there were, hundreds of applications that we had that were great, that were meritorious, that we would have funded if we had more money. So that's number one. We just need more money to fund more grants to push this forward. But second, having been in biomedical research for 30 years and running my own lab and also applying for grants my entire career, science funding is broken. I mean, it's fundamentally broken. As a researcher, I have a research lab. I'm constantly I have to fund every salary. So the salaries for myself and everyone who works for me, all my PhD students, my postdoctoral fellows, my technicians, everyone in my lab, I fund their salary, their benefits. I fund all of the equipment, all of the supplies, everything. I have to raise the money for that. So that's why I apply for grants from the government, from private foundations. And so governmental grants tend to be for a very specific project, right? So an NIH grant that I get, it might be somewhere between 3 and 5 years long for different amounts of money. None of that is enough to run my whole lab. So what you end up with is this patchwork of grants that are for different amounts of money, different lengths of time, and they might be for a very specific project. But then when that project ends, you have to apply for another grant. And so the science might shift. The other thing about especially governmental grants is that they tend to reward like very incremental science. So it's basically like the incentive structure that we have for science funding is completely misaligned with what we want scientists to do, which is to ask like moonshot questions, to think about paradigm shifting experiments, to like really be creative. And you can't do that if you're constantly trying to fit into a box with a grant that is for a specific project. So there's only one funding model in science that I know that works, and it's called HHMI. And we don't need to delve into it, but at the end of the day, people who are lucky enough to get HHMI funding, they fund the scientist, like in the lab, not a specific project. They give them enough money and a runway of 7 to 9 years to do real work, right? And they give them the freedom to do whatever they want. So like, the most about your science, you're the expert, you go do whatever you want to do, be creative, take risks. And if you look at, it's called HHMI, it's the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So it was from the estate of Howard Hughes is where this all came from. But if you look at HHMI investigators over their history, they're like way overrepresented in Nobel Prize winners, in science that you've heard of. So if you think about like in the last 5 years, what scientific discoveries or what things do you know about CRISPR? That was an HHMI investigator. Nobel Prize winners, like most of them have had or are HHMI investigators. And so we can't be HHMI. They have a budget of $600 million a year. But what we can do is think about with these grants, how do we make it so that if someone's doing something that we think is worth continuing, because we're giving away at this point 2-year grants. And what I don't want to have happen is for those projects at the end of 2 years, for them to die or for them to have to pivot and do something else to get some other grant. So we want to have a second pot of money that is specifically for sustainable funding so that existing grantees or former grantees or center members can apply to that and keep doing what they're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about this, crowdsourcing idea?
Yeah.
Half of the population are women. They have a lot of power. We want to invest in things that are for women and by women.
$5 from, 100 million people will do a lot.
Right. So, let's talk offline about how we can.
I have a lot of ideas. So we have a lot of, it has to be done in the spring, I think, but we're thinking about doing a social media campaign that would be like the Ice Bucket Challenge. So the Ice Bucket Challenge raised $100 million for ALS research in 6 weeks. Wow. And most of the people who did it didn't donate money at all. And the people who did, most of them donated $5 or less. So it would be the egg toss challenge.
I love it. I love it. I want to be. I want to.
Lots of ideas like that. I also think we're approaching companies, particularly like large luxury skincare that focuses on women and particularly focus on aging in women. Companies like that, but also any companies that have products designed for women, to ask them whether they would be willing to put a passive donation form, like field in their checkout. Do you want to donate to research for women's health, like $1 or $3, but just like a passive thing at the checkout to ask if they would be willing to do that.
I know things like that. A lot of female brands and some great people actually that we'll talk with. But this has been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
So funny to get to have for so long. But
I know, and I can go on and on. Sorry.
I love it. No, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only, and views expressed on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Kayla Barnes, does not accept responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of the information contained herein. Opinions of their guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.